Rebecca Mitchell carefully ran her gloved hand along the helicopter's tail rotor assembly, her experienced eyes catching details most people would miss. At 42, she had inspected more military aircraft than she could count during her 8 months as a civilian contractor at Fort Carson, Colorado. The sprawling base kept her busy, especially with the upcoming training exercises putting extra strain on the aviation unit. "Hey, Mitchell, you planning to spend all day on that Black Hawk? We've got 5 more birds waiting." Maintenance Chief Warren's voice boomed across the hangar, drawing annoyed glances from other technicians. Rebecca didn't rush. Thoroughness had been ingrained in her for too many years to abandon it now, especially when lives depended on her work. "Almost finished, Chief," she replied evenly. "There's an issue with the stabilizer bar dampener that needs documentation." Warren approached, his heavy footsteps telegraphing his irritation. At 55, the retired Army sergeant had made it clear from her first day that he considered female inspectors to be a military accommodation he couldn't comprehend. "Can't you just sign it off? Major Peterson needs this bird operational by 1400 hours. Rebecca straightened to her full height, still a good 6 inches shorter than Warren. "Not with a potential metal fatigue issue. I don't sign off on aircraft that could kill people." "Always dramatic," Warren muttered. "This is why women shouldn't." "Shouldn't what, Chief Warren?" Rebecca's voice remained professional, but something in her tone made the bigger man step back slightly. "Just get it done," he grumbled, turning away. Rebecca returned to her inspection, making detailed notes in her tablet. The young specialist assisting her, Private Torres, handed her a flashlight without being asked. "He treats all the civilian contractors like that," Torres offered, "but you get it worse." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I've dealt with worse than Chief Warren." Much worse, though those stories belonged to another lifetime, one carefully separated from her present identity as just another helicopter inspector with prior service, vaguely mentioned in her file. By afternoon, Rebecca had completed her inspections and filed reports recommending 3 helicopters for immediate maintenance and clearing 2 others for flight operations. She was washing up in the restroom when she overheard 2 female pilots talking. "Did you hear about the VIP coming tomorrow? Apparently, we're getting a visit from Colonel Davidson himself." "The Ghost Rider, I thought he was stationed at the Pentagon now." "He is, but word is he's evaluating some new combat extraction protocols. All the pilots are talking about it." Rebecca froze, soap suds running down her wrists. She hadn't heard that call sign in years, Ghost Rider. Her heart pounded as memories flooded back, unwelcome and vivid. She dried her hands and returned to the maintenance office to gather her things. Her shift was ending, and she needed time to think. If Colonel Michael Davidson was coming to Fort Carson, she might need to request leave immediately. "Mitchell," Warren called as she collected her helmet and backpack. "Major Peterson wants you to inspect his personal bird first thing tomorrow. Some big shots coming, and he wants his helicopter perfect." "I'm scheduled for the training fleet tomorrow," she replied, already calculating how quickly she could request emergency leave. "Plans change. Oh, and wear the official inspection uniform, not those ratty coveralls. We need to look professional." Rebecca nodded absently, her mind elsewhere. In her 8 months at Fort Carson, she'd managed to maintain her anonymity, just another competent civilian contractor with military experience. No one had connected Rebecca Mitchell, helicopter inspector, with Captain Rebecca, Archangel, Lawson, decorated combat pilot. At home that evening in her small apartment just outside the base, Rebecca pulled a battered footlocker from the back of her closet. She hadn't opened it since moving to Colorado. Inside lay carefully preserved remnants of her former life, photographs, medals, and her old flight helmet. The helmet's dark green surface was scuffed from years of service, but the call sign stenciled on its side remained clear. Archangel in faded white letters, with a pair of wings extending from the air. She traced the letters with her fingertip, remembering the night she'd earned that name during a desperate rescue mission in the mountains of Afghanistan. The mission that had made her a legend among certain special operations units. The mission that had brought her face to face with then Major Michael Davidson. 10 years, she murmured. 10 years, and he still doesn't know the whole truth. Rebecca returned the helmet to the footlocker, closing the lid on her past. Tomorrow she would request leave, citing a family emergency. She would avoid any chance of crossing paths with Colonel Davidson. But as she prepared for bed, her phone chimed with a text message from Warren. Inspection moved up. 6:30 tomorrow, VIP arriving early, no exceptions. Rebecca stared at the message, a sense of inevitability settling over her. Perhaps it was time to stop running from her past. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. She slept poorly, dreams filled with the sound of rotors and the orange glow of distant explosions. When her alarm sounded at 5:00 a.m., she was already awake, staring at the ceiling. Rebecca dressed carefully in the contractor's inspection uniform, tan pants, and a blue button-down shirt with the company logo. Standard issue, forgettable. Just what she'd wanted when she took this job. As she gathered her equipment, her gaze fell again on the footlocker. After a moment's hesitation, she opened it and removed her old flight helmet. She couldn't say exactly why she placed it in her backpack alongside her inspection tools, but something told her she might need it today. The base was already humming with activity when she arrived, earlier than usual. Additional security checkpoints had been established, and military police scrutinized IDs with extra attention. "Big day," Rebecca asked the guard who checked her contractor's badge. "Colonel Davidson from the Pentagon is observing some training exercise," he replied. "Apparently, he's some kind of legend in aviation circles." "I've heard that," she said neutrally. Rebecca made her way to the VIP hangar where Major Peterson's personal helicopter waited. The Black Hawk sat gleaming under the bright lights, already spotless from an earlier washing. "You're late," Warren barked as she entered, though her watch showed she was 20 minutes early. "Traffic at the checkpoints," she replied, setting down her equipment. "I'll get started right away." "Make it fast but perfect. The bird needs to be ready in 90 minutes. Rebecca began her inspection methodically, checking every system with practiced efficiency. The helicopter was well-maintained, as she expected for an officer's personal transport. She was examining the engine compartment when she heard the hangar doors open and the sharp sounds of multiple people entering. "Major Peterson, thank you for arranging this," came a deep voice that made Rebecca's hands still instantly. "I'd like to observe the pre-flight inspection if that's not a problem." "Of course, Colonel Davidson. Our best inspector is handling it personally." Rebecca didn't turn around. She kept working, hopping against hope that they would simply observe from a distance. But footsteps approached, and soon she felt presences directly behind her. "Ms. Mitchell is extremely thorough," Peterson was saying. "She's been with us 8 months and has already prevented several potential incidents." "Proper inspection saves lives," came Davidson's voice closer now. "Something I learned the hard way in Afghanistan." Rebecca had no choice. She turned, wiping her hands on a cloth, and faced the group. Major Peterson stood there with 2 aides, and beside him was Colonel Michael Davidson, older now, with streaks of gray in his dark hair, but unmistakable. "Sir," she acknowledged with a nod, keeping her expression professional and detached. Davidson's eyes met hers with the casual disinterest of a superior officer acknowledging a contractor. No recognition flickered there. Of course not. Captain Lawson had worn a flight helmet during their brief interaction 10 years ago, and facial features change. Rebecca had cut her once-long brown hair short, and years of Colorado sun had weathered her complexion. "How's the bird look?" Peterson asked. "Clean so far, sir. Just finishing the engine compartment, then I'll check the rotor systems and avionics." "Excellent, Colonel. Would you like some coffee while we wait?" The officer's mess sent over a fresh pot. Davidson nodded, his attention already shifting away from the unremarkable helicopter inspector. "That would be fine." Rebecca returned to her work, relief washing through her. He hadn't recognized her. She would finish the inspection and be gone before anything could trigger his memory. But as the officers moved toward the small office at the side of the hangar, Rebecca's backpack tipped over from where she'd placed it on a workbench. Her old flight helmet rolled out, coming to rest with the call sign clearly visible. The sound made Davidson turn back. His gaze fell on the helmet, and Rebecca watched as confusion, then shock transformed his features. He stumbled backward, actually reaching out to steady himself against a tool cabinet. "Archangel," he whispered, his face draining of color. "My God, it can't be." The hangar fell silent. Major Peterson looked between Colonel Davidson and Rebecca with confusion. "Sir, is everything all right?" Peterson asked. Davidson's eyes remained locked on Rebecca. then shifted to the helmet on the floor with its Archangel call sign clearly visible. "Where did you get that helmet?" Davidson demanded, his voice hoarse. Rebecca straightened, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "It's mine, Colonel." "That's impossible. Captain Lawson died 10 years ago in the Hindu Kush Mountains. I was there. I saw the helicopter go down." Major Peterson was completely lost now. "Colonel, this is Rebecca Mitchell, our civilian inspector. She's been with us for 8 months. "No," Davidson said, stepping closer to Rebecca. "This is Captain Rebecca Lawson, call sign Archangel, one of the finest helicopter pilots the Army ever had." His voice faltered. "A pilot who sacrificed herself to save my entire team." The moment had come. After 10 years of anonymity, of rebuilding her life piece by piece, Rebecca found herself facing the past she'd tried so hard to leave behind. "You only saw what I wanted you to see that night, Colonel," she said quietly. "The helicopter that crashed was empty. I had already transferred your wounded to the second bird." Davidson's face showed pure disbelief. "That's not possible. We were under heavy fire. The extraction point was compromised. Your Black Hawk took multiple hits and went down in the valley." "Yes, it did." Rebecca's voice remained steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "After I programmed it to fly unmanned on a divergent course, a distraction while I flew your men out through the narrow pass to the north in the backup helicopter." Major Peterson was staring at Rebecca now. "You're saying you're some kind of hero pilot who faked her own death?" "I'm saying I did my job," Rebecca replied simply. "The mission parameters changed, I adapted." Davidson seemed to be processing her words carefully, his tactical mind reconstructing the events of that night. "The second helicopter? It wasn't at the primary extraction point. How did you even reach us?" "I landed 2 clicks away and proceeded on foot. Your radio operator was dead and you couldn't call for extraction, but I could hear your team's emergency beacons." "You came into an active hot zone on foot." Davidson's voice held a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I did what was necessary," Rebecca said, "just like you would have." Warren had approached during this exchange, his face showing growing confusion. "Mitchell, what the hell is going on here?" Davidson turned to Warren, his military bearing returning. "Chief, I need the hangar cleared immediately. Security personnel only. Major Peterson, please escort your maintenance staff outside." The authority in his voice brooked no argument. Within minutes, the large hangar stood empty except for Rebecca, Davidson, and 2 stone-faced military police officers by the door. Davidson approached Rebecca slowly, as if afraid she might disappear. 10 years, he said quietly. 10 years believing you died saving us. 10 years of carrying that weight. His voice hardened. Why the deception? Why let the world think Captain Lawson died in that valley? Rebecca moved to her backpack and carefully returned the helmet to it. "That wasn't my choice, Colonel. When I returned to base with your wounded certain, complications arose." "What complications?" She met his gaze steadily. "The mission you were on wasn't sanctioned. Your team was operating without proper authorization in a restricted area, an area where American forces weren't supposed to be." Davidson's jaw tightened. "We were tracking a high-value target." "Without authorization," Rebecca repeated. "When I brought your wounded back, questions were asked that certain people didn't want answered, about why an elite special operations team was in that valley, about what they were really doing there." Understanding dawned in Davidson's eyes. "So they made you disappear." "They gave me a choice," Rebecca corrected. "Disappear officially, take a new identity, and never speak of what I knew, or face charges for participating in an unauthorized cross-border operation." "That's insane. You saved 9 lives that night." "And I would have been the perfect scapegoat if the truth had come out." Rebecca's voice remained calm, though the old anger stirred beneath her words. "Captain Lawson died heroically. A tragic loss. Case closed. No uncomfortable questions about why your team was really in that valley." Davidson ran a hand over his face. "I never knew. They told us you'd been given a posthumous Silver Star. There was a memorial service." "I'm aware. I saw the photos." The colonel stared at her, decades of military discipline visibly battling with raw emotion. "But why now? Why keep that helmet? Why risk exposure after all this time?" Rebecca hesitated. How could she explain the complexity of living a life that wasn't fully her own? of surrendering her identity, her achievements, her very history. "The helmet reminds me of who I really am," she finally said. "And I never planned for you to see it. I didn't know you were coming to Fort Carson. So it's coincidence that you're here, working as a helicopter inspector at the same base I'm visiting." Rebecca understood his suspicion. In their line of work, coincidences were rarely that. "I've worked at 7 different bases in 10 years, she explained. "Moving regularly keeps questions to a minimum. I requested a transfer here 9 months ago because the Colorado climate helps with old injuries." She rubbed her left shoulder unconsciously. "I had no idea our paths would cross again." Davidson studied her for a long moment. "Those old injuries from that night." "Yes, not all of us made it out unscathed." Something shifted in Davidson's expression, a softening, a recognition of shared sacrifice. "Rebecca, what they did to you was wrong, forcing you to abandon your identity, your career." "I made my choice," she interrupted, "and I've made peace with it." "Have you?" Davidson challenged gently. "Then why keep the helmet? Why hold on to Captain Lawson when you're supposed to be Rebecca Mitchell now?" The question struck deeper than she'd expected. Why had she kept these connections to her past? Why not embrace her new identity completely? "Because she matters," Rebecca admitted quietly. "What Captain Lawson did that night matters, even if no one else knows the truth." Davidson took a step closer. "I know the truth now, and I'm not without influence these days." Rebecca shook her head. "Don't, please. I've built a life here. It's not the one I trained for, not the one I wanted, but it's mine. If you start asking questions about that night, about what really happened." "The people who buried the truth are still in power," Davidson finished for her, "still protecting themselves." "Exactly, and they wouldn't hesitate to bury me for real this time." The colonel's face hardened with resolve. "Not while I'm alive." Before Rebecca could respond, the hangar doors opened and a young lieutenant hurried in. "Colonel Davidson, sir. General Hammond has arrived ahead of schedule. He's asking for you at the command center." Davidson's expression showed momentary frustration, then returned to professional composure. "Tell the general I'll be there in 5 minutes, Lieutenant." When they were alone again, Davidson turned back to Rebecca. "This conversation isn't over. I won't expose your identity without your permission, but there are things you need to know, things that have changed." "Nothing has changed for me," Rebecca insisted. "I'm just a helicopter inspector now." Davidson's eyes moved to her backpack where the helmet was now hidden. "No one with that call sign is just anything. Finish your inspection, Ms. Mitchell. We'll continue this discussion later." As he strode from the hangar, Rebecca felt the careful walls she'd built around her past beginning to crumble. For 10 years, she'd lived as someone else, burying Captain Lawson and her actions that night in the mountains. Now, with a single chance encounter, everything threatened to resurface. The heroism, the sacrifice, and the dangerous secrets that had forced her into the shadows. Rebecca completed her inspection of Major Peterson's helicopter with meticulous care, despite her churning thoughts. Years of training had taught her to compartmentalize, to focus on the task at hand regardless of external pressures. Lives depended on her thoroughness, and she wouldn't compromise that for anyone, not even a colonel from her past. When Warren returned to the hangar, his attitude had noticeably changed. Whatever Davidson had said to him had transformed his usual dismissive manner into awkward deference. Ms. Mitchell, he corrected himself, "is the inspection complete?" "Yes," she replied, signing off on the digital checklist. "The aircraft is flight-worthy. I've noted some minor issues for the next maintenance cycle, but nothing that affects immediate operations." Warren nodded, not quite meeting her eyes. "Good, that's good." He hesitated, clearly struggling with curiosity. "Colonel Davidson seemed to know you." "We've crossed paths before," Rebecca said simply. "He ordered me to reassign your duties for the next 3 days. You're to be available for his technical consultations regarding the training exercise." Rebecca stiffened. "I have scheduled inspections for the training fleet." "Already reassigned. Whatever's going on, it's above my pay grade." Warren shrugged, a hint of his old attitude returning. "Just try not to cause problems for the rest of us." After he left, Rebecca gathered her equipment, carefully securing her old helmet in her backpack. She should leave now, request emergency leave, drive away from Fort Carson, disappear again before Davidson could pull her further into the past she'd tried so hard to escape. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was simple fatigue from years of running, or perhaps it was the look in Davidson's eyes when he recognized her, not just shock, but something deeper. Grief, guilt, unfinished business. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Officers' quarters, Building 47, Room 103, 1900 hours. We need to talk. MD. Rebecca checked her watch. She had 6 hours to decide whether to meet with Davidson or to run. 6 hours to weigh the risks against her growing need for answers. She spent the day in a small, unused office in the maintenance building, catching up on paperwork and avoiding interaction. At 18:45 hours, she made her decision and headed toward the officers' quarters, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Building 47 was an unremarkable structure housing visiting officers. Rebecca passed through security with her contractor's ID, drawing curious glances from the MP on duty. Visitors to the officers' quarters weren't unheard of, but civilian contractors rarely had business there. She found room 103 and knocked precisely at 1900 hours. Davidson opened the door immediately, now dressed in casual Army PT gear rather than his formal uniform. His quarters were austere, standard military-issue furniture with a laptop open on the small desk and folders stacked neatly beside it. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Rebecca admitted. Davidson gestured to one of 2 chairs by a small table. "Please sit. Would you like some water? It's all I have to offer at the moment." "Water is fine." As Davidson filled 2 glasses from a bottle, Rebecca noticed a familiar folder on his desk, olive green with red border markings indicating classified content. The label tab read, Operation Archangel. Her call sign, the operation named after her. Davidson followed her gaze. "Yes, that's what they called it afterward, the mission to recover my team. They named it after the pilot they believed died saving us." He placed the water on the table and sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of 10 years hanging between them. "Why did you agree to meet me?" Davidson finally asked. Rebecca considered the question. "I'm tired of running, and I think I deserve some answers." "As do I," Davidson replied, starting with the truth about what happened that night, the full truth. Rebecca took a slow breath. She had never spoken about the events of that night to anyone, not even the intelligence officers who had debriefed her before orchestrating her disappearance. "Your team was compromised," she began quietly. "You'd lost communication with base, and you had 3 critically wounded men. I was piloting the primary extraction helicopter with Captain Torres as my co-pilot. We received your emergency beacon, but were ordered to maintain position until confirmation came through proper channels." Davidson nodded grimly. Standard protocol when a special operations mission goes sideways. They needed to assess whether extraction would expose more assets to risk. "Torres and I monitored your beacon for 2 hours while your situation deteriorated. The weather was worsening and night was coming. Finally, Torres said something I'll never forget. Protocol won't matter if they're all dead when we get there." Rebecca paused, remembering the determination in her co-pilot's eyes as they made their fateful decision. "We launched without authorization. Torres took the second helicopter as backup while I took the primary bird. When we reached your coordinates, the extraction zone was hot, much worse than reported. Your team was pinned down, and enemy fighters were using the high ground for mortar placement." Davidson's jaw tightened. "We'd walked into an ambush. Someone had compromised our mission before we even crossed the border." "I realized a standard extraction was impossible," Rebecca continued. "Landing the primary helicopter would have resulted in all of us being killed, so I implemented an alternate approach." "The diversion," Davidson said. "You programmed the primary helicopter to fly itself." Rebecca nodded. "Basic autopilot with some modifications. I set it to fly a predictable path that would draw enemy fire while I proceeded on foot to your position. I carried only essential medical supplies and my sidearm." Davidson leaned forward. "You crossed 2 kilometers of hostile territory alone, reached our position, stabilized my wounded men, and then somehow extracted all 9 of us in the second helicopter that no one knew was there." His voice held quiet awe. "It was the most extraordinary feat of piloting and courage I've ever witnessed." "I did my job," Rebecca said simply, "just as you would have done yours." "But there's more to the story, isn't there? Something happened after you got us out. Rebecca's expression tightened. This was the part she'd never told anyone, the real reason Captain Lawson had to disappear. During the extraction, I monitored enemy communications, she said carefully. My secondary MOS was intelligence with a focus on regional languages. I heard things I wasn't supposed to hear. Davidson's eyes narrowed. What kinds of things? Coordinates, names, references to American personnel. Rebecca met his gaze directly. Evidence that someone on our side had provided information to the enemy forces in that valley. Information about your team's movements, about the primary extraction plan. Davidson went very still. You're saying we were betrayed. I'm saying I heard communications that suggested prior knowledge of your mission from sources that shouldn't have had that information. Rebecca chose her words precisely. When we returned to base, I included this in my initial report. And that's when they decided Captain Lawson needed to disappear, Davidson concluded, anger edging his voice. Not to protect operational security, but to bury evidence of betrayal. Within 12 hours of filing my report, I was isolated, debriefed by intelligence officers I'd never seen before, and given my options. Rebecca's voice remained steady despite the old anger resurfacing. Accept a new identity and disappear, or face charges for violating direct orders and compromising a classified operation. Who, Davidson demanded, who gave you those options? A Colonel Peterson, not related to your Major Peterson, I believe. Davidson's face darkened. Martin Peterson, now General Peterson, Deputy Director of Special Operations Command. Rebecca felt a chill. Then you understand why I've stayed hidden, why Captain Lawson needed to stay dead. Davidson stood abruptly and moved to his laptop. Peterson wasn't acting alone. He was protecting someone higher up the chain. He pulled up a file and turned the screen toward Rebecca, someone who's now in position to do even more damage. The screen showed a news article with a familiar face, General William Hammond, recently nominated to serve as the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The same General Hammond who had arrived at Fort Carson that morning. Hammond was the overall theater commander for our region when my team was ambushed, Davidson explained. He personally authorized our mission across the border. Rebecca's mind raced. And if word got out that he had approved an unauthorized operation that went badly wrong? His career would have ended then and there, Davidson finished. Instead, he's about to become the highest-ranking military officer in the country. Rebecca felt sick. A decade of hiding, of surrendering her identity and achievements, all to protect men who had ascended to even greater power. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. What's changed? Davidson returned to his seat. 3 months ago, I was assigned to review historical special operations for lessons learned. I pulled the files on our failed mission and the subsequent extraction. The official records were sanitized, but there were inconsistencies I couldn't ignore. He reached for one of the folders on his desk and removed a worn photograph. This was taken from our team's helmet cameras that night. It's the only image we have of Archangel. The photo showed a pilot in full gear, face obscured by helmet visor and oxygen mask, helping load a wounded soldier into a helicopter. Only the call sign on the helmet was clearly visible. I've spent 3 months quietly investigating what really happened, Davidson continued. Following paper trails, interviewing survivors from my team, reconstructing events. I came to Fort Carson this week not for the training exercise, but because intelligence suggested Rebecca Mitchell might actually be Captain Rebecca Lawson. Rebecca stared at him. You knew I was here, this wasn't coincidence. I suspected, I wasn't certain until I saw that helmet. Davidson leaned forward intently. Rebecca, Hammond and Peterson buried the truth once. They destroyed your career and identity to protect themselves. But now Hammond is about to gain power that could put countless other service members at risk. What are you asking me to do? Rebecca demanded, though she already knew the answer. Tell the truth. Come forward with what you know, what you heard that night. With your testimony and the evidence I've gathered, we can stop Hammond's confirmation. Rebecca stood, packing the small room as the magnitude of his request sank in. You're asking me to sacrifice everything again, the life I've built, the peace I've found. I'm asking you to be Captain Lawson one more time, Davidson said quietly, to complete the mission you started 10 years ago. Rebecca turned to face him, conflict evident in her eyes. And what happens to Rebecca Mitchell afterward? Do I just disappear again, start over with identity number 3? No, Davidson said firmly. This time we do it right. This time you get your life back. Rebecca left Davidson's quarters with her mind in turmoil. The colonel had laid out his plan. Carefully gathered evidence combined with her testimony could expose the truth about that night in Afghanistan and the subsequent cover-up. But the risks were enormous, not just to her carefully constructed life, but potentially to national security itself. Think about it, Davidson had urged. Hammond is arriving tomorrow for the full briefing. We have 48 hours before he returns to Washington for his confirmation hearings. Now, as she drove back to her small apartment off base, Rebecca weighed her options. She could run, disappear again before Davidson could involve her further. She had emergency funds and alternate identification ready, habits from years of living in the shadows. Or she could stay and fight, reclaim Captain Lawson's identity, and seek justice not just for herself, but for the men who had died because of command decisions that night. At home, Rebecca removed her old flight helmet from her backpack and placed it on her kitchen table. The call sign stared back at her, a reminder of who she had been and what she had sacrificed. Sleep eluded her that night. Instead, she pulled out her footlocker and spread its contents across her living room floor. Photographs, medals, letters, and mission reports she had managed to keep during her transition to Rebecca Mitchell. Physical reminders of a life cut short by political expediency. Among the items was a small, worn photograph of her helicopter crew from Afghanistan. 6 faces smiled at the camera, arms around each other's shoulders, the camaraderie of those who risked their lives together evident in their expressions. Only Rebecca remained alive. 2 had died in separate incidents before that fateful night, and Torres and the other crew members had been on the primary helicopter when it crashed as a diversion. The official record listed them as casualties of a failed extraction attempt. Their families had received folded flags and practiced condolences. They deserved better. They deserved the truth. By morning, Rebecca had made her decision. She arrived at Fort Carson earlier than usual, her old flight helmet secured in her backpack once again. Instead of reporting to the maintenance hangar, she headed directly to Building 47. Davidson answered her knock immediately, as if he'd been waiting. His expression showed both relief and respect when he saw the resolve in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said without preamble. "Not for you, not even for myself, but for my crew, for Torres and the others who died that night while I lived." Davidson nodded solemnly. "Thank you." He stepped aside to let her enter. "We need to move quickly. Hammond's schedule has been accelerated. He's arriving in 3 hours for an abbreviated visit." Inside, Rebecca was surprised to find another person waiting. A woman in civilian clothes with the unmistakable bearing of a senior officer. "Rebecca, this is Elizabeth Carter," Davidson introduced. "Deputy Inspector General for the Department of Defense. She's here unofficially until we determine our next steps." The woman extended her hand. "Captain Lawson, it's an honor to meet you. Your actions that night were extraordinary, whatever the official record says." Rebecca shook her hand cautiously. "You believe our allegations against General Hammond?" "I believe they warrant serious investigation," Carter replied carefully. "Colonel Davidson has presented compelling evidence of irregularities in the official record. Your testimony could be the final piece we need." For the next 2 hours, Rebecca walked them through every detail of that night, from the unauthorized launch to the desperate extraction, and most critically, the enemy communications she had intercepted suggesting advanced knowledge of the mission. "I speak Pashto and Dari," she explained. The enemy fighters referenced specific details about extraction protocols that weren't common knowledge. They knew exactly where the primary helicopter would attempt to land. Carter took meticulous notes. "And you included this in your initial report?" "Yes, the report that was supposedly lost in processing after I was debriefed by Colonel Peterson's team." Davidson spread several documents on the table. Peterson's involvement is clear from these communication logs. He personally ordered the reclassification of Captain Lawson's report before it could reach proper channels. "And Hammond?" Carter asked. "No direct evidence linking him to the suppression of the report," Davidson admitted. "But he was the authorizing officer for the original mission, and its failure should have triggered a formal investigation that never happened." Rebecca glanced at her watch. If Hammond is arriving in an hour, what exactly is our plan? We can't just confront a four-star general with these allegations without proper authorization. Carter and Davidson exchanged glances. Actually, Carter said carefully, that's precisely what we intend to do. Not as an accusation, but as an opportunity for General Hammond to address these discrepancies before his confirmation hearings. Rebecca stared at them. You want to ambush the next potential chairman of the Joint Chiefs here, today. We want to present our concerns directly, without interference from his supporters at the Pentagon, Davidson clarified. If Hammond has legitimate explanations, he should provide them now before these questions arise in a more public forum. It was risky, borderline insubordination from Davidson's perspective, and potentially career-ending for all of them if Hammond chose to retaliate. But Rebecca understood the strategy. Hammond would be relatively isolated at Fort Carson, away from his usual protective staff and power base. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Your presence," Davidson said simply. "Your testimony about what you heard that night and your willingness to go on record officially." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I'll need my helmet, the call sign. It tends to make an impression." Davidson smiled for the first time since their reunion. "I'm counting on that." An hour later, Rebecca found herself in the base commander's conference room, seated beside Davidson and Carter. Her flight helmet sat on the table before her, the Archangel call sign clearly visible. They had arrived early, positioning themselves strategically so that Hammond would see the helmet immediately upon entering. The door opened precisely on schedule, and General William Hammond entered, flanked by aides and the Fort Carson base commander, Colonel Richards. Hammond was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered despite being in his early 60s, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to power. His eyes swept the room as he entered, landing first on Davidson, whom he acknowledged with a nod, then shifting to Carter with mild curiosity. When his gaze finally settled on Rebecca and the helmet before her, he froze mid-stride. The blood drained from his face so rapidly that one of his aides stepped forward in concern. But Hammond waved him off, his eyes never leaving the call sign on the helmet. "Archangel," he said, his voice barely audible. "Hello, General," Rebecca replied evenly. "It's been a long time." Hammond's military discipline reasserted itself quickly. He straightened, turning to the base commander. "Colonel Richards, I need the room cleared immediately. Just these 3 individuals remain." Once they were alone, Hammond approached the table slowly, his gaze moving between the helmet and Rebecca's face. "Captain Lawson, you're supposed to be dead." "Many people are supposed to be things they're not, General," Rebecca replied. "Like commanders who are supposed to protect their troops rather than betray them." Hammond's expression hardened. "Watch your accusations carefully, Captain. You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Rebecca said, rising to her feet. "I heard the enemy communications that night. They knew details about our extraction protocols that could only have come from someone with access to our operational plans." "Circumstantial at best," Hammond dismissed, though his eyes betrayed concern. "Enemy forces often monitor our communications." "Not these details," Rebecca insisted. "They referenced the specific approach vector for the primary helicopter, information that was classified and transmitted only via secure channels." Davidson stepped forward. "General, we're not here to make public accusations. We're here to address discrepancies in the official record before they potentially impact your confirmation hearings." Hammond's gaze snapped to Davidson. "So this is a shakedown? What do you want? Promotions, assignments?" "We want the truth," Carter interjected. "As Deputy Inspector General, I have a duty to investigate potential breaches in operational security that led to American casualties." For a long moment, Hammond seemed to be calculating his options, weighing the threat they presented against possible responses. Rebecca could almost see the tactical mind that had propelled him to 4-star rank working through scenarios. "The truth," he finally said, his voice lowered, "is far more complicated than you imagine." He sank into a chair, suddenly looking older. "What happened that night was a tragedy, but not for the reasons you think." Part 5, The Vindication. Hammond stared at the helmet on the table, its call sign a silent accusation. "You believe I betrayed American forces," he said finally, "that I somehow compromised the mission." The evidence suggests information was leaked, Carter replied carefully. And subsequent efforts to suppress Captain Lawson's report indicate consciousness of guilt somewhere in the chain of command. The general's eyes moved to Rebecca. Tell me exactly what you heard in those enemy communications, word for word if you can remember. Rebecca had replayed those transmissions in her mind countless times over the years. They referenced the American birds coming to grid coordinates that matched our primary extraction point. They specifically mentioned the first landing zone being prepared, which suggested knowledge of multiple extraction options. Hammond nodded slowly. And this is what you reported to Colonel Peterson after returning to base? Yes, along with my concerns about the implications. Did it ever occur to you that the leak might have been intentional? Hammond asked quietly. A calculated decision to feed specific information to the enemy. Davidson straightened. A deception operation. The mission your team was on, Colonel, was only part of a larger strategic objective, Hammond explained. While your unit was tracking the high-value target, we had a second team moving to intercept an even higher-value asset 10 kilometers to the north. Rebecca felt a chill. You sacrificed Davidson's team as a diversion. Not intentionally, Hammond insisted, his voice hardening. The intelligence suggested the enemy forces would be minimal at your location. The leaked information was meant to draw additional fighters away from the northern operation. He looked directly at Davidson. Your team should have encountered token resistance at most. The intelligence was wrong. Davidson's face had gone pale. My men died for a diversion. Your men died because intelligence failed us, Hammond corrected. When we realized the situation had deteriorated, we attempted to abort your extraction to prevent further casualties. But by then, communications had been compromised. Rebecca struggled to process this new information. So you didn't betray American forces deliberately. You just miscalculated the risk and then covered it up when things went wrong. The northern operation succeeded, Hammond said quietly. We captured an individual who provided intelligence that prevented 3 major attacks on American forces, attacks that would have killed hundreds. He met their gazes directly. I stand by the strategic decision, even as I regret the cost. And Captain Lawson, Carter pressed. Why erase her from the record? Why force her into a new identity? Hammond sighed heavily. Because she heard communications she shouldn't have heard. Because her report threatened to expose an ongoing deception campaign that was still active. And because some of my staff thought she might have been compromised herself. Compromised? Rebecca repeated incredulously. You disobeyed direct orders, Captain, Hammond reminded her. You launched without authorization, implemented an unauthorized extraction plan, and then returned with a report containing classified information you shouldn't have been able to access. From a security perspective, that raised red flags. She saved 9 lives, Davidson interjected heatedly. My life, my team. Yes, she did, Hammond acknowledged. Which is why I insisted on a choice rather than direct action. A new identity, a continued service to her country, rather than a court-martial for violating direct orders during a classified operation. Rebecca absorbed this explanation, testing it against her memories of those chaotic days after the mission. It made a certain cold, strategic sense, the kind of calculation that high-level commanders made every day. If what you're saying is true, Carter said carefully, there should be documentation. Records of the northern operation, the strategic decision to leak information, the security concerns about Captain Lawson. Hammond nodded. Classified at the highest levels, but yes, documentation exists. Then I want to see it, Rebecca stated firmly. All of it before your confirmation hearings. Hammond studied her for a long moment. You're not in a position to make demands, Captain. Actually, she is, Davidson countered. We all are. Because regardless of strategic justifications, the fact remains that you buried the truth about that night. You allowed Captain Lawson's crew to be listed as casualties of a failed mission rather than acknowledging their sacrifice in a successful deception operation. And you permitted Captain Lawson to lose her identity, her career, her very existence, Carter added, when she could have been recognized for extraordinary heroism. Hammond's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, that his carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. What exactly do you want? He asked finally. Rebecca picked up her helmet, running her fingers over the call sign that had defined the best and worst moments of her life. I want the truth made official. I want my crew's sacrifice recognized for what it really was. I want my identity back. And if I agree to this, what guarantees do I have that you won't go public with your original allegations? You have our word, Davidson said simply. If the documentation supports your explanation, we'll accept that strategic necessities sometimes require difficult choices. Hammond considered this, the political and personal calculations evident in his expression. Finally, he nodded. I'll have the files transferred to the Inspector General's office within 24 hours, with certain redactions for ongoing operations. And Captain Lawson's status, Carter pressed. If the review confirms her actions as heroic rather than compromising, her record can be reinstated. Hammond looked directly at Rebecca. Though returning from the dead creates its own complications. I'm familiar with complications, General, Rebecca replied evenly. As Hammond rose to leave, he paused, looking again at the helmet in Rebecca's hands. For what it's worth, Captain, the call sign was appropriate. When reports came in about how you extracted Davidson's team, flying through a mountain pass in darkness that no helicopter should have been able to navigate, Archangel seemed fitting. He extended his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Rebecca shook it, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement of the complex realities they had all navigated. After Hammond departed, the three of them sat in silence, absorbing the implications of the General's revelations. Do you believe him? Rebecca finally asked. Parts of it, Carter replied thoughtfully. The strategic deception operation fits with other classified activities from that time period, but I suspect the full truth is more complicated than what he shared. It always is, Davidson agreed. The question is whether the documentation will support his version enough to satisfy us. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood at attention in a small ceremony room at the Pentagon. She wore her Army dress uniform for the first time in a decade, the fabric feeling both foreign and familiar against her skin. The captain's bars gleamed on her shoulders, along with the combat patches and ribbons she had earned. The room contained only a handful of attendees, Davidson and Carter, the current Army Chief of Staff, and 3 family members of her helicopter crew who had been cleared for the classified ceremony. Captain Rebecca Lawson, the Chief of Staff read formally, for extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against hostile forces on April 17, 2015, while serving as a helicopter pilot in Afghanistan. As he continued reading the citation, Rebecca reflected on the whirlwind of the past 3 weeks. Hammond had indeed provided the documentation, which largely supported his explanation of a strategic deception operation gone wrong. The files also confirmed the security concerns about her actions, though they acknowledged these concerns were primarily raised by Colonel Peterson rather than Hammond himself. The Inspector General's review had been thorough, and in the end, validated Rebecca's actions that night as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds. Her military record had been reinstated, her years of service recognized, and her new status established as previously classified active duty rather than deceased. Hammond's confirmation hearings had proceeded without incident. The man would indeed become the next chairman of the Joint Chiefs, though now with the knowledge that his past decisions remained under scrutiny by those who understood the full story. It is my honor, the Chief of Staff concluded, to present Captain Rebecca Lawson with the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions. As the medal was pinned to her uniform, Rebecca thought about identity, how hers had been taken, hidden, and now restored. She was neither fully the Captain Lawson who had flown into danger that night nor completely the Rebecca Mitchell who had inspected helicopters at Fort Carson. She was something new, a synthesis of both experiences. After the ceremony, Tor's mother approached her, tears in her eyes. He always said you were the best pilot he'd ever flown with, the older woman said, gripping Rebecca's hands. Now I understand why. Davidson joined them as the small gathering dispersed. What will you do now, Captain? Your official status has been restored, but your position is unique. Rebecca smiled slightly. Colonel Davidson, are you offering me a job? As a matter of fact, I am. My unit needs someone with your particular combination of skills. Someone who understands both the technical aspects of helicopter operations and the human cost of strategic decisions. An advisory position, Rebecca guessed. With occasional field work, Davidson confirmed. Your experience living under a different identity gives you insights few others possess. Rebecca considered the offer. After a decade of hiding in plain sight, of suppressing her skills and knowledge, the opportunity to serve openly again was tempting. I'll need time to consider it, she said finally. I've been someone else for 10 years. I need to remember who Captain Lawson really is before I commit her to anything. Davidson nodded in understanding. Take all the time you need. The position will be there. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room, Rebecca opened her footlocker one last time. She carefully returned her medals and photographs to their places, no longer hidden away but preserved as part of her history. The official documents acknowledging her service and sacrifice now joined them, tangible proof that her story, while complicated, was finally acknowledged. Last, she placed her flight helmet in the locker, the Archangel call sign still visible despite years of wear. Once a source of danger when glimpsed by Colonel Davidson, now a symbol of identity reclaimed. Rebecca closed the footlocker but didn't lock it. For the first time in 10 years, she had nothing to hide. She was no longer just inspecting helicopters. She was Captain Rebecca Archangel Lawson once more, her history restored, her future open, and her call sign a reminder that sometimes, against all odds, justice and truth could prevail.